Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast delving into one issue affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our editor, David Horovitz. David, thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure, Amanda.
We are going to talk about what's happening right now in this Israeli moment in which so much is opaque in terms of the Gaza war. We're going to discuss the feelings on the ground here inside Israel, and we'll talk about how international media is also deciphering what they know or don't know about what's happening on the ground in Gaza. All of this and more when we're back.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation for humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on two fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, Anachnu amcha b'nei britecha. We choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our editor, David Horovitz. David, we learned this morning about the deaths of 3 Israeli soldiers. We are just coming off of a holiday-long weekend. Israel is reeling, but of course, international media is not leading with the soldiers' deaths, rather with the suspected or at least alleged deaths of Gazans inside Gaza who were trying to collect aid. This isn't the first time that these allegations have been made, and indeed, it's probably not the last as we know it. And unfortunately, it's almost impossible to decipher what is going on inside Gaza right now. So let's just first start with, how are we, the Times of Israel, trying to report on these allegations of deaths while collecting humanitarian aid inside Gaza?
Well, the issue is incredibly problematic, and we've talked about this, and that's kind of part of the point for the entire 19 months plus of the war. From the beginning of the war, and that is the nature of war. Of course, there is unclarity, but this is an unprecedented war in many ways, notably including that it is being waged in an area where the government turned every civilian facility potentially, and I suspect, very, very, very widely, into a weapons base or a source of gunfire, or built tunnels underneath it and entrances to tunnels from within it, and booby-trapped buildings, and basically even sort of mosques and things. A few years ago, we would be horrified at the notion that somebody would store missiles in a mosque. That's a complete norm for Gaza. That's been the case the whole time. Not only that, the government of Gaza, Hamas, has made it impossible for anybody to report fairly without fear of consequence. I don't know how many people in Gaza are trying to do decent and objective reporting, but they are placing their lives in danger if they say anything or write anything critical of Hamas. And then, of course, there are people very widely documented who are masquerading as journalists or acting as journalists when, in fact, in the employ of Hamas. And at the same time, you have no international, objective, independent, proven media able to work in Gaza. That's, partly an Israeli official position. Israel has prevented international media from basing itself in Gaza. The concern of the Israeli authorities has been that if journalists are moving all over a war zone throughout Gaza, they're going to get killed or risk being killed, and Israel will be blamed for that and does not want to place itself in that situation. And the same applies to local media, to our reporters, to Hebrew media, and so on. We are given very limited access. Partly, I'm sure, for the same reason, that if you give journalists extensive access, there's the risk to their lives in a war zone. But it means that we don't have free access to any and everything that we would want to see, even if our reporters were prepared and are prepared to take a degree of risk. They're not able to do so. So when reporters are allowed, foreign press and our reporter and Hebrew press are allowed into Gaza, it's in very constrained circumstances, and they're shown what the army wants them to show or feels safe showing them, and so on. By the way, even some of those ostensibly relatively safe brief embedding, if you like, and that's not really what it is, it's more limited than that, have not been without danger. I mean, our reporters have been close to things going bang in unexpected circumstances and have reported and elaborated when that was the case. I'm not revealing anything that they didn't say at the time, but it's very limited, and therefore what you're to expand on your question, because it's a very important question, what you are grappling with is an endless source of unverifiable information coming out of Gaza on the news agency feeds, in some cases on social media. Some of it is really obviously not true and is being sent by Hamas, and there's no reason to believe that it's true. There's no confirming information. Some of it, including from Hamas-run health authorities, is potentially true, and there's really very, very little way of knowing. In some cases, there is eyewitness testimony. In some cases, there is footage that appears to be credible, and you're weighing that all the time. And in a competent Israeli official environment, you would then be weighing that against what official Israel is saying. But, and again, this is not the first time that we've been saying this, but I think it's become more acutely pathetic from an official Israeli point of view. Very often there is no remotely real-time Israeli narrative at all. I mean, I want to stress here, I'm not talking about hasbara, I'm not talking about propaganda, I'm not talking about spinning information as sides do in war to make them look as good as can be done. I'm talking about basic narrative of what has happened. So you have routinely Hamas claims, and you have routinely no Israeli other sequence of events. You do get the Israeli army telling you, we're checking into this. And I'm sure we're going to come on and to discuss the last few days. That's not terribly helpful. We can cite Israel saying, we're looking into that. But that, you've got very specific information alleged on one side, and we're looking into it on the other side. And then, of course, I'll add one more thing, which is, of course, our reporters phone and check and try to reach sources in Gaza and try to reach Israeli official sources and try to speak to Israelis who may know things but aren't really authorized to say, but maybe will tell them and help us understand and get to the truth without giving their names and so on. I mean, we try relentlessly when it is clear that we don't have the full picture. Unfortunately, that's a very, very common circumstance.
Right. And as our reporters are speaking with all these different individuals, each of whom have some kind of agenda, they need to siphon out truth versus agenda from every single person they're speaking with. Because who is on the ground right now in Gaza, David? It's the NGOs, it's the Gazans, and the army, essentially. Who else is there and with whom we can speak? So the army is not actually in every single location all the time. So when the IDF is actually checking into something, they potentially actually need to investigate what was happening, because it's quite possible that they weren't even in the area, such as some of the cases that we've been hearing about with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation program and the aid parcels that are being distributed there. So it is a very tricky situation, and a lot of it has to do with a lack of trust. Of course, there's no way of verifying all sorts of information. So it is, who are you able to trust, because you're not able to go out there with your own eyes. But just this morning, for fun, I took a look at some of the news outlets that I tend to open my day with, and that includes the New York Times, The Guardian, Al Jazeera on my phone, of course, because it's blocked in Israel. And it's very stark to see how these different outlets are reporting on the allegations from Hamas. There is no suspension of disbelief. These facts, quote unquote, which could be facts, as you said, are being reported as statements, not as allegations. So how did we get to this situation, David?
So a few things. I mean, first, the point that you made there in passing of the army not being everywhere where it is alleged to have done things. Yeah, that's a huge burden, I suppose, on the army in terms of we're not even there. How would we, we claim we were not even there. How would we even know what's happened? But while you're prosecuting a war, you're attacking a terrorist government, there need to be resources made available and expertise. And we are so far from that. I mean, if that was the worst problem, that the army, it takes a while for the army to clarify things in areas where it was not deployed, so it's able credibly to say, hey, we were not deployed here. We're not talking about that as the prime concern. We're talking about a sort of network or a hierarchy there that is just not functioning in any remotely satisfactory way from the point of view of getting the truth to the people who report it. And the only conclusion when there is nothing coming out from the Israeli side is, well, you've got one side telling a story and you've got another side saying nothing, and then that kind of brings you to the point you were making, which is for some outlets, a Hamas claim is so credible that it's not even attributed to Hamas. It is just described as fact. I don't think that's the case in with all outlets. There are some who occasionally make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but are trying to attribute effectively. And there are some that for a long time, not talking about the last few days, attribute material that's come from Hamas, or don't attribute it, state it as fact. X number of people have been killed, or give ostensible or give attributions that do not really tell the full picture of who the people that they are citing really are. So, there are health authorities and there are hospital officials, but it should be made clear to readers that these are people who are operating, again, in an environment where they're directly run by Hamas, or they are in an environment where they cannot disagree with material that Hamas wants to see put out. So it's the responsibility of media to try to get to the truth, and when they can only rely on secondhand information, it is their responsibility to make clear who that information comes from and allow readers to judge whether they should take it seriously, how seriously to take it. But again, I mean, I hope I've made this clear in the last few minutes. It's a very, very difficult environment where ultimately, let's face it, if you trust your reporter and your reporter is there, then hopefully that is material you can present as fact. But when it's not your reporter, and it's almost never our reporter, then it's very, very hard to know, even when you've weighed the relative merits of who's saying things and how possible and how credible and so on. It's, you're trying to make responsible assessments, and you're trying to be transparent in doing that, so that a reader might say, yeah, okay, it's the Hamas health authorities, but we think they're telling the truth. Okay, I can't, that's for the reader to determine. But if we're saying it's the Hamas-controlled health authorities, we're signaling to readers that this is a source that is in thrall or employed by or working under the pressure of a terrorist organization that lies and that is seeking to destroy Israel and harm Israel. Then you can draw, conclusions and so on. So we try to do this as fairly as we can. It's very, very difficult, and all media is grappling with it, with greater and lesser success in terms of journalistic credibility.
Right. And of course, neither of us are saying that there aren't terrible things happening on the ground. There are terrible things happening on the ground. People are suffering in this 19, almost 20 months of war. It's a very difficult, terrible situation for all involved. But at the same time, when we are trying to fuel a 24/7 news site, like so many of the outlets are that I named earlier, it's so tempting, shall we say, to give in to the low-hanging fruit, meaning, as you said, when the Hamas-run health ministry is sending out statements on numbers of dead and giving its own version of the story, it's very tempting, I would say, for news organizations to use these facts, especially since the changeover of the IDF spokesperson, there is almost a vacuum, or there is a vacuum of information on the Israeli side. So, David, you've noted before that with the changeover from IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari to the current spokesperson Defrans, there has been a bit of a shift in approach, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that is the case. I think that's undeniably the case. I just take a step back. You correctly, there's a war going on in Gaza, and non-combatants are being hurt and killed, and Israel had an official policy of restricting humanitarian aid for many weeks, and only began to relent under tremendous international pressure. And the process of delivering aid is shrouded in contradictory information, especially in the last few days, including relating to death among people trying to get to aid. Very, very difficult to penetrate fog, and some people are lying, that's for sure. The trouble is it's very hard to work out who and exactly over what. But, let's take the one step back and say Hamas invaded Israel on October the 7th, 2023, and then had converted Gaza basically into a state riven with terrorist infrastructure, hundreds of kilometers of miles of tunnels built under every civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, and basically placed the people of Gaza most deliberately for years in preparation, in harm's way. I don't think Israel has ever done an effective job at an official level in explaining the context in which it was trying to make sure that Hamas, which is vowing to do this again if it can, Israel trying to make sure that Hamas cannot revive and do this again, invade again, and carry out its declared goal of destroying Israel and killing Jews, right? But something I think changed in terms of the capacity to explain even the basics. I would say from March, when the January hostage ceasefire deal broke down, and that coincided more or less with the new leadership of the army. The former chief of staff had stepped down, a new chief of staff took over. The army spokesman, Daniel Hagari, who was familiar and will be familiar to everyone who's listening and watching this conversation because he was out there all the time. He was I don't know, in Hebrew it's easier to say that he was kind of forced to be fired or to step or forced to resign, whatever. He's not the army spokesman anymore, and he gave a great deal of information. He gave information. His English was not perfect, but he made the effort. He spoke in English pretty frequently. Early in the war, he was on television all the time, including material that was prepared for international outlets. There were periods when he appeared less. He wasn't, insistently appearing every evening on our screens, but when there was important stuff to say, he said it. And behind the scenes, there was a lot of information made available to military reporters, Israeli military reporters, foreign correspondents, in briefings and so on. So they had access to information, and he was pretty receptive. His office was pretty receptive, not perfect in real time by any means, but clearly there was an effort there, and it wasn't solely focused on Hebrew-speaking media. In the last few weeks, I would say that the new leadership, and especially the new spokespeople, are appearing less, have less to say, as far as I know, are giving fewer briefings, and the nature of the conflict has actually required a greater flow of information, because you have a conflict now where what Israel is trying to do in Gaza is pretty dramatic. It is openly, the army has said this, it is openly moving to take control. The army has said of 75% of Gaza in 2 months. So now in the next month and a half, it had been controlling about 40%. So it has told the world that it is expanding its control in Gaza. It has told the world that it is ordering, encouraging, warning, telling Gazans to evacuate. Specific instructions are given intermittently, in some cases several times, and people are told to move to areas. We've published this. I wrote about it in a column just a week ago. Our military correspondent, Emmanuel Fabian, who you speak to all the time, has specified. We had a little map there showing sort of a diagrammatic map, a kind of sketch map, but giving essentially the areas where Gazans are being told these are the areas to which you should evacuate. That's one thing. You also have a political leadership speaking in, not entirely of one voice, but leading ministers in government talking about, and Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, who has a defense ministry role as a minister as well, talking about leveling Gaza, destroying Gaza, not withdrawing from the territory, even if hostages are returned, wanting to see Gazans leaving. You've seen Prime Minister Netanyahu, as of the last 2 weeks, adding to the goals or the conditions for which he would end the war, destroying Hamas, getting the hostages back, making sure Hamas or Gaza can no longer be a threat to Israel, and adding this fourth condition now, which is the implementation of Donald Trump's Gaza vision. Now, Donald Trump's Gaza vision is both unworkable and confusing. How are you going to relocate all of Gazans without Hamas going with them? That's one part of the unworkability. Morally alarming, I would say, requiring people to leave their territory, which is what he said originally. And then he talked about, no, we won't be expelling people. We'll be encouraging people to leave to places that will take them in. It's not clear that there's anywhere that will take in sizable numbers of Gazans. And yet that is now prime ministerial policy. So at a time when the political leadership is telling the world, yes, we are displacing essentially all or almost all of Gazans to fairly limited areas of the Strip, and we are requiring that they relocate voluntarily. I don't even know how to define that requirement. Not voluntarily, it's not clear, because the Trump plan as set out by Trump has said both of those things. So you're working in an area where the world is looking askance at the declared policy, and then you have an army. And by the way, we didn't talk about civilian public diplomacy, right, narrative and so on. We can come on to that in a second. But you have Hamas alleging terrible things are being done by Israel. Hamas not credible, I should stress for the umpteenth time, and Israel largely silent. So politically, a very, very tendentious policy. And in terms of real time, what's going on, well, not clear at all from the Israeli side what's going on. It's a pretty toxic and problematic environment for official Israel to be operating.
Let's go to a short break.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life, and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. Took me a long time. Took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. Israelis are often called sabres, based on the prickly fruit of the cactus that actually, I believe it was the Ottoman Empire brought into the Holy Land. It's not indigenous to Israel. But as sabres, these prickly people, there's often this stance to just not explain yourself when you're in a problem. And this is, based in my own life, this is something that often leads to a bit of a dissonance when you're talking with other cultures, shall we say. And so I do wonder sometimes when we hear about this utter lack of information or any kind of ability or even inclination to explain yourself to the international stage. I'm talking about Israel has this utter lack of ability or inclination to do this. I just wonder if it's just Israelis being Israelis and saying, you know what, it doesn't matter what we say, yes or no. The world is going to hate us anyway, just as the world always hates Jews anyway. And so we're just going to keep with our truth, and we're going to continue our struggle how we feel like we should be conducting it. Do you think there's any grounds to my theory here, David?
That Israelis think it doesn't matter? It's absurd. Pathetic, unforgivable, irresponsible, unnecessary. I don't know how many more words I can. Somebody in authority with the power to change it chooses not to because they think it doesn't matter. No, I don't think so. I think Israel. I don't know. I've been talking and writing about this for decades, and it becomes ever more unconscionable and unforgivable. And of course, it matters. And anybody with a modicum of understanding of the world can see that it matters. It does not mean that even the most effective public diplomacy would shift the needle from one end to the other. But that's not the same as saying it wouldn't move and gradually help people understand what's going on and gradually enable people to get a better understanding. You can't. It's another battlefield, and it's arguably, I don't know if it's even the most important. It's certainly way up there at the top. You're fighting a battle on the ground, and you're also fighting to create an environment in which people will understand why you're doing what you're doing and will know clearly what it is that you are doing. You can't abandon that battlefield. It's unthinkable, and yet that has been the case. It's been the case forever, essentially, as in terms of current affairs are concerned. A really resonant example was 2010, I think it was, when the Mavi Marmara sailed for Gaza to try to break the Israeli blockade. Well, that was deemed to be an unforgivable blockade. How could Israel be preventing supplies reaching Gaza? Except, as we all know, Hamas exploited every potential product influx of material, anything that could be subverted for use in its war machine. And it was unfortunate that Israel wasn't able to stop more of that going in. But this ship was commandeered by naval commandos when it declined to stop. They thought they would be confronting peace activists, and instead they were beaten on the deck of the Mavi Marmara, and I think 11, maybe 12 of the thugs who beat them up were killed. Israel had all the footage and didn't release it. Didn't release it until a long time afterwards, citing security concerns, and therefore the story went around the world that harmless, gentle peace activists had been savagely murdered unprovoked by Israeli naval commandos. And much later, even people who were associated with that flotilla acknowledged what had happened. Many, many years later, I should say. So, that was 15 years ago. Now we're, right now, and we didn't get onto the last 3 days yet, but I'm sure we will in a second, we're in a situation where there's essentially no Israeli public advocacy, to the point now where I think some people in real positions of relative authority don't even know the game it is that Israel is not playing. They don't really understand what's happening. They don't understand where the news is coming from and how media works, social media and conventional media. In terms of the basic parameters, Amanda, there's a public advocacy directorate. It's run out of the Prime Minister's office. To the best of my knowledge, it has nobody running it at the moment. I might be mistaken. If there is somebody, they're not doing a very good job. It is not properly staffed. There was a spokesperson who was born to the job, Elon Levy. Never have I seen in recent years somebody who, acted like a human being when explaining what was going on in the service of Israel. And he was suspended until further notice because he had sinned in joining demonstrations against the judicial overhaul between working for the president and being asked to work for Israel in the prime ministerial hierarchy there. So even somebody who was great was booted out for completely marginal and self-defeating reasons, shall we say. I don't know what the specifics are right now, but the foreign ministry allocated hundreds of millions of shekels to set up a media room. You'd think, wouldn't you, that if you had a media room, its prime responsibility would be to disseminate information in real time so that media trying to report what was going on here had somebody to turn to ask questions other than the army, which has, a water fight as well as when it can to explain it. But I don't know that that's the case at all. It's certainly, we have not had, as far as I know, access, because the foreign ministry has a media room, to information in a more helpful way than was the case before. I've heard suggestions that this media room is designed to go after media that misreports. That's, I don't know. If people are reporting things that are factually incorrect, then sure, they should be put straight. And in many cases, I think would be pleased to be put straight if they've made a mistake. Journalists don't generally like to get things completely factually wrong. I'd like to believe that is still widely the case. But if you've allocated a lot of money for a media room, why aren't we feeling that there's any change there? Why is there no more real-time information coming out? The idea that people would think, well, what's the point? Everybody hates us anyway. That's just, like I said, unforgivable. And I think there's just maybe the people in authority just look at the task and are cowed by it. I'm not sure that's the case. Maybe the people in real authority above them, and ultimately, of course, everything goes back to the prime minister, have not prioritized this, have not made effective appointments, have not retained the employment of capable people. That's certainly the case. Have not prioritized it in the way that they need to. I have no words. It's not my job to do advocacy for Israel. It's our job here to report things as fairly as we can. So I can say, as somebody who cares about this country and its well-being, that it is incredibly damaging for Israel, that it has no public diplomacy to speak of, public advocacy to speak of. Again, I'm not even talking about propaganda. It's very important to me to say this. I'm not talking about spinning material. I'm talking about giving journalists, and by extension the world, access in reasonable time to what Israel says is happening. And that's just an unconscionable failure.
Right. We are not an advocacy organization, but yet by having the word Israel in our very name, we are obviously taking a stance, right? We are very pro the existence of Israel. And I wonder, David, if you have felt any kind of conflict alongside with our work of trying to be as objective as possible with this utter vacuum of any kind of information that's going out into the world. Have you found yourself pushed to be reporting stories in any kind of different way than perhaps you would as an objective journalist? You also do write a column, I should add. So perhaps that is where you have an outlet to your utter disbelief that potentially it's possible that the Israeli echelons are not reporting, not filling this information vacuum through the belief, potential belief, I think they believe it, that it doesn't matter anyway what we say. So how are you finding yourself, again, being pro the existence of Israel during this very long war in which everyone is being pulled in many different directions? Have you seen your reporting change at all?
So yeah, I do write op-eds, and I've over the years, including recently, written pieces that deal with this issue, and they're marked op-ed, they're opinion pieces. We're the Times of Israel. Yeah, we're pro this country surviving. We think it's important that Israel survives, and there isn't a contradiction, in my opinion, between wanting Israel to survive and thrive and wanting to report it accurately. They share the same goal. And it's very frustrating, of course, when you can't report accurately. But that doesn't mean we've skewed our reporting to make it look somehow better for Israel. I actually wouldn't really, whatever. We don't do that. Our reporters, we agonize like normal people. What do we make of this? How credible is this? Who can we speak to who might have more of an insight into what's going on? That's what reporting is meant to be. And this is a 24/7 thing. It really is, Amanda. And it needs to be a 24/7 thing because things are happening all the time. And again, you're facing 24/7 the stream of unverifiable information, and you're trying all the time to make sense of it and to work out how credible it is and to speak to people who might help you to understand how credible it is. It's frustrating. I certainly, in terms of the way we operate and the conversations we have as an editorial hierarchy, we try to get to the truth. And I don't see any other way to do journalism.
Right. And I would just like to add on my own behalf that obviously not every member of the Times of Israel staff holds the same beliefs, right? And the fact that David writes op-eds doesn't necessarily mean that every staff member is just in line with what David is saying. In fact, I would say quite the opposite. And there is a plethora of opinion and dissent in our editorial meetings. And we welcome that, of course, but it is David who writes the op-eds for the most part. So it is perhaps a little bit blurry for some of our readers because they can read your op-ed and perhaps they believe that this is the editorial line, but I would say no. In fact, there is quite a difference of opinion among the staff members, even on the very nature of this war. And that is something that reflects the Israeli public itself. We do report on the protests that are happening, and we do report on all the different polling that's happening. I think the quieter voices are those who believe that the war should continue, and they're apparently the minority in Israel right now. But the fact is, everyone wants the hostages home. The question is which way and how to finish up this terrible conflict that is costing so many lives every single day on both sides. How do you, as the editor-in-chief of the Times of Israel, harness these different opinions that are, happening right now throughout Israel, grassroots, and among your editorial staff? And how do you bring them forward to the world?
Well, we have a weekly editorial meeting, as probably, again, we've discussed this before, and we talk about stories that we think we should be working on. And in terms of the discussions that lead to the commissioning of pieces and the areas that we devote resources and so on, we try to get at it from a journalistic perspective. I don't actually know the partisan opinions of most of the reporting staff. I don't want to, and I don't want it to come out in their reporting. And like I say, if it's not clear to me from their reporting, that's because it's not clear, because their reporting is not a case of showcasing their partisan opinions. So when we're discussing, for example, what's unfolding in Gaza and how to cover it and how credible this is and what's been going on and stuff, we try to discuss it from a journalistic perspective. Obviously, nobody is free of preconception and bias, but we are trying to do our job as journalists. And I think I don't want to make comparisons with other organizations, but this is traditional journalism where you are not force-feeding or skewing your reporting because you want people to think A, B, and C. No, you're trying to get to the facts and to the truth. And when it's not a news piece, but it's analysis, then it's marked as such. And when an analysis piece strays into or doesn't work for whatever reason, as an analysis, because it is too opinionated, it is marked as a piece that is an op-ed or appears on the blogs platform if it's somebody somewhere outside the staff. In other words, if you read our site and you read it in a way that it is deliberately marked so that you can distinguish from reporting that is not trying to steer, reporting that is fair-minded, or analysis which is marked, or op-eds which are marked, you hopefully will get some sense of both what is going on, the actual facts, and the variety of ways in which you might understand it, and what ultimately, in the case of the op-eds and the blogs, you might choose to think, oh, that's actually quite a sensible way of looking at it. By the way, I would add that things are not permanent. The great joy of having brains and intellects is you can reassess, and when you have access to credible information, you can reassess hopefully on the basis of what's actually going on. All of this, or some of this at least, I think you used to be able to take more for granted, that you actually had access to truth widely in many sources of information. I think that's narrowing, and we're this old-fashioned, in the best use of the word, in my opinion, in we are trying, our reporters are trying to tell it like it is. And our platform, our site, gives areas where, you can agree with somebody's opinion piece, but it's marked as such. I think the harder challenge really now is the basic reporting. Everyone can sit in their room and spout off opinions. Ultimately, they're all basing themselves, or they're ignoring, or they're skewing material that is coming out. And I think the hardest challenge for journalism, and it's certainly never been harder for us than in the last 19, 20 months, is to get the facts first. Then you want to go off and opine, or you want to stay in and analyze, fine. But getting to the facts has never been harder.
David, thank you so much for giving me your time today.
Okay, thank you, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.